Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Friday Intelligence Brief edition of Daniel Davis Deep Dive, where we show you some of the major things that we learned this week on our show, because I know everybody doesn't always have time to watch every show, but we jam-pack this thing here with lots of information that you need and things that you're not going to get other places. And man, is that ever going to be true today? You're going to see that we've talked about a number of things that sometimes you don't see on the mainstream media at all. Sometimes they only cover it slightly, but we've provided the depth for it. And I'm going to pull out a number of things today that we learned that I want to make sure everybody gets this week. We're going to, first of all, start off in an area we don't cover that often, and that is in the Indo-Pacific in Taiwan. We had both Chaz, Ambassador Freeman, and Colonel Jacques Beau had been talking both this week about Taiwan. We put them together to give you this wisdom, nuggets of wisdom.
If we get into a war with China, by the way, every war game that's been played shows we lose the bulk of our Air Force and our Navy. Yes. They do too, but they produce 70 times more tonnage of ships per year than we do. Let me make a fundamental point here. China has been involved with Taiwan since 1642, when a rival dynasty was set up following the fall of the Ming and the establishment of the Qing in Beijing. For 40 years, in 11 different attempts, in which cost probably 500,000 lives, the Chinese mainland attempted to reunite Taiwan with it. It finally succeeded in 1682. The assumption that if you win a battle over Taiwan, you've won the war,
it's over.
Is absolute nonsense. This is something Chinese care passionately about. We would devote endless resources to recovering California if somehow it were taken by Japan or China or Mexico. We would never give up. And it's a mistake to imagine the Chinese will give up either.
You have to remember that in the mind of the Chinese, Taiwan already belongs to China.
Right.
And by the way, the Taiwanese think the same thing. For both of them, there is only one China. The only point of difference is that for Taiwan, the government should be in Taipei, and for Beijing, the government should be in Beijing. This is the only difference. The Taiwanese don't want to be independent from China.
You know, the thing that really stands out about both of those is that there need never be a war over China and Taiwan. And even if foolish heads prevail, the United States doesn't ever need to be involved in it. And there's very specific reasons. As Colonel Beau said there toward the end, this is a Chinese issue. And for people who don't know, and I know that a lot of people don't, the whole issue between China and Taiwan is actually a continuation of the 1949 Civil War, which frankly started even longer ago than that. But that's kind of when it basically culminated, and when the communists drove the nationalists off the mainland. And Chiang Kai-shek, if you're aware, used to be the ruler of all of China, but they lost the Civil War. They went across to escape there, and that's where they've been set up ever since. And so this is an unresolved civil war going back into the middle of last century. It's not something that we need to be involved in. We can help provide weapons, for example, for Taiwan to defend itself. But whether they go to war should be between them, because it's a Chinese issue. Both of them agree that there is one China. They just don't agree on which one that is. They disagree very strongly, as a matter of fact, on which one that is. But as long as the status quo remains, there doesn't need to be any war. As long as they don't go independent, or we don't support them in that movement of independence. But if we get foolish and we want to take action on that, and if China and Taiwan do get into a fight, and we have the foolishness of thinking we're going to get involved with it, and we fight China over Taiwan, which many people want to do, Ambassador Freeman really laid out why that is just a suicidal thing to do. Number one, a lot of these war games that he's talking about, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, I believe in January of this year, December last year, January this year, they ran a number of computer simulations with a lot of experts. I think they ran 24 iterations of the cycle. And in all of them, according to what they showed, they said that the U.S. prevents China from taking over Taiwan. What they don't tell you in that simulation is that they only modeled 3 weeks. So in 3 weeks, according to their calculations, we prevent China from taking the island. But as Ambassador Freeman points out, a war is not a battle. And so if that starts out the first time, as he pointed out from history, China has in centuries in the past been willing to spend enormous amounts of time, resources, and manpower to take that Taiwan. It was Formosa in the past. And the idea that China would ever give up and fail just because they were blunted in the initial time is they're not going to. They would keep on. The second issue is an equipping and a ammunition capacity issue, which wasn't addressed there at all, which is almost as significant as that cultural issue that's involved here. We don't have enough ammunition to sustain a long war with Ukraine. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, they thought that it was going to be something quick. They thought that by rolling 4 axes of tanks into the country, that the government would realize they couldn't win and would just give up. That's what they thought. But the Ukraine side didn't. They didn't care about what it looked like, what they should do. They fought anyway. Now Russia is 2.5 years later, or 2+ years later, is in the fight, for its life. And now then, because they're now prepared, they're starting to roll over and they're going to end up winning that. But because they could sustain it, the West has been helping Ukraine sustain. They would never have been able to last this long. They would have culminated a long time ago, and Russia would have already won had it not been for this large infusion from the West. Here's the thing. If the U.S., who is the one providing the bulk of this stuff to Ukraine, gets in its own war over here in China, we don't have the industrial capacity to get into a long war. If it goes longer than 3 weeks, we're screwed because China is prepared for this. They have the industrial capacity several times larger than what the United States has. They are producing large-scale numbers of the kinds of weapons that war would fight, namely missiles, air defense interceptors, drones, those kinds of things that are necessary to sustain. Yes, they have to have landing gear and all kinds of other things to get on the ship. Definitely the air component would be a major component of that. But what this war is showing you, that once the initial barrage is over, the victor is going to go to the side that can sustain combat for a longer time. China's prepared for it. We aren't. We could run out, according to those CSIS schedules or simulations, within weeks, like a few weeks, not even a large number of weeks. And then once that's over, all of our ships would be at risk of being sunk. Once all of our interceptor missiles have been used up, even if the defensive shield works flawlessly, they're out of ammunition, and China won't be out of missiles and drones. And so if we got into a war, we would almost certainly lose. And so I put that in there, and in my perhaps vain hopes that American policymakers, whatever their ambitions, will recognize that we don't have the capacity to make good on what some people say, that we should go to war with Taiwan, against China with Taiwan. We shouldn't do it. Let's hope that saner and cooler heads prevail. Okay, next thing I'll show you. This is another one of those things that you will not see anywhere else but Daniel Davis Deep Dive. I have not seen this information that we're about to show you from earlier in this week on any other channel, on any mainstream news media, etc. This has to do with what happened when the Iranians launched that large drone and missile barrage, up to 350 total pieces, on April 13th in retaliation for the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus. So you may recall during that time, all of the media in the West routinely and roundly mocked the Iranians, and said that they were not capable. And this shows just how strong Israel is, because the Iron Dome and all of their air defense capacity shot down 99%, and that 1% that got through didn't cause any real damage. And the implication being that it shows how impotent Iran is, and that they're now much weaker than they were, but the Israelis are more secure than anybody thought, and it would be foolish for anyone to try again. But as Ted Postel, MIT professor, who has an extraordinary eye for seeing things that you and I would never see in some of the videos that were shows, has a different view.
You're showing a video now where 2 missiles came in. They were not engaged at all. You don't see any evidence of interceptors in the air, and they came in and exploded. There it is again. It's actually the same engagement with a different camera viewing it. No evidence of interceptors. So here again, you're showing warheads coming in. What you'll see, these are missiles coming in. You see these bright flashes that trail behind the actual missile. That's pieces of the missile breaking off. and it's just left behind. And the net result is the pieces of the missile slow up and fall to the ground. And in fact, what happened in the Gulf War of 1991, and it looks like it happened here as well, is the warheads basically got torn off the front of the missile and fell independently. So there's no accuracy associated with these warheads. Some of the warheads probably fell kilometers short of the target they were intended for.
Now, I strongly recommend you go back into our archives there and watch that full episode. It is absolutely fascinating. And we're also planning on having him back next week because he's going to go into more depth on how the Iron Dome system does work, how those kind of missile interceptors function, so you can get a better idea of how it really works. It's absolutely fascinating. He's already shown us some advance of the information he's going to show. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that one myself, just to learn, much less just have him on the show. But there's some real ramifications behind this that everybody needs to understand. And I think it's not lost on the people in the region. Everyone, and especially in Israel, was patting themselves on the back and talking about how great they were in public and on the camera. But I think behind the scenes, they're well aware of what the implications of this were. Now, Iran overall is a middling to weak power in the region. They don't have the ability to project power. Their land forces are moderate, but not that good. And they, in fact, didn't perform very well in the Iran-Iraq war. And by all estimations, their ground forces are probably not a lot better than they are right now. Their navy is mainly of speedboats. They don't have very many large combatants, but they have a lot of speedboats, and they have the ability to mine the Straits of Hormuz, for example. So if push comes to shove in a worst case scenario, they could cause a great deal of damage to the global economy by shutting down like nearly a quarter of the world's flow of oil throughout the world and gas. So they have some capacity. Their missile force, however, is not weak. That's the big issue there. While the country itself is not strong, their missile force may be the premier power in the region. And now then, their drone systems are also becoming very, very good. Here's the ramifications of what that 13 April incident shows and what Ted Postal's analysis reveals and exposes to a public. Now, anyone who's watching our show, the Israeli defensive forces was not anywhere near as successful in its Iron Dome and other interceptors as was claimed. A lot of what Iran apparently did was they used a lot of their older missiles, some of their older inventory. They definitely used their slow-moving drones because they wanted these things to be shot down, because they did not want to get into a war. So they didn't want to use their capacity to break through the Israeli defenses. They didn't attack areas that were not defended by the Iron Dome. They went specifically where they knew they would be shot down, or these older weapons. Many, apparently half of them didn't even arrive on the target. And as Ted showed you there, many of them were literally falling apart as they were on their descent into the target area, which means they didn't even hit what they were pointed at. But you just noticed they weren't intercepted. That's the key thing to understand. Some of the other missiles that if you'll watch that full episode, some of the more powerful missiles from Iran weren't intercepted at all and did hit their target. And when you looked at an analysis of where they landed on that airbase that was out in the desert, is they hit pinpoint targets, and they chose, like one place they hit a swimming pool. In other places, they just kind of hit on part of a runway, but near buildings where there were troops, buildings where there were aircraft. So they intentionally did not target things that would have escalated it. But here's the key. They can. If push does come to shove, if Israel does launch more attacks in there, Iran has very clearly communicated to them that they can penetrate that air defense system with their better missiles and their more sophisticated stuff, or they can attack targets that are not as defended, or alternatively, they can saturate the Iron Dome system, even in the areas where it is protected, because once they run out of interceptor missiles, and I don't know if you heard, but some reports are suggesting up to 50% of the interceptor missiles were expended that night alone on only 350 targets. If Iran, which has tens of thousands of these drones and thousands of other missiles, launches a barrage kind of thing, they can saturate the first several waves and eliminate all the interceptor missiles. And then the subsequent waves, nothing will be there to stop it. Israel, I think, is aware of that. And we need to be aware of it too. so that the balance of power is more balanced than some people believe. That's the truth of what's happening in the Middle East. Okay, moving on to the next one here. Now then, we're going to talk into the Russia-Ukraine war, and we had Jason Beardsley on to point out that there are some big problems with the Ukraine side, which underscores why we keep arguing that the war can't be won by Ukraine. And in addition to the issue of the manpower, which is the biggest issue, the shortfall that the Ukraine side is suffering, there's two other big issues that Jason pointed out.
The Ukrainian armed forces do not have a history of long conventional warfare that establishes a non-commissioned officer corps that executes orders coming down from an officer corps that are all concerted back in a Pentagon or a headquarters. And right now they've been relying on the U.S. to sort of imitate that stuff. We're giving them intelligence that's coming from places like Poland and big fusion centers. And we got a lot of people that lost our two wars advising the Ukrainians how to win their war. Yes. You can fake the funk a little, but notice that we don't have generals in our ranks that have won wars.
That's a really sobering thought right there. We've actually had former NATO Colonel Jacques Beau on our show, who kind of packaged that whole thing together in that we have the NATO and U.S. side is a system of systems that's all well-resourced, trained, and educated all the way up the ranks, and none of that exists here. And you can throw a bunch of pieces, hundreds of armored vehicles in that package, but without a system and without trained personnel, it's just noise on the battlefield. They're not needing more armored vehicles in the defense. That's more something for an offense. This is not really providing what they need right now anyway. You know, there's also, in addition to those issues, especially on the manpower issue, there was, I think it was in the Business Insider, I'm not sure, it's on many of the Ukrainian media today as well, that some of the complaints of an American military volunteer who was helping to both fight and train in Ukraine, and apparently had been a veteran of the U.S. military and had combat deployments, openly admitted, he said, listen, the West, we don't know how to fight big operations. We know how to do counterinsurgency. We know how to do, fighting against Taliban type guys or ISIS in the Middle East. We know how to do these little wars against countries that don't have air forces, don't have drones, you don't have electronic warfare, don't have armies per se. We just don't have much. We don't have any experience with that in the near term, and the Ukraine side does. And so they're actually saying we don't really want your training anymore because it's not as good. We heard some of this actually last year in the aftermath of the operation for the offensive operation that Ukraine launched. We heard a lot of it then, but now apparently they're getting even more tired of it because we don't even have the knowledge to train them who does fight this kind of a battle. And there's a lot of truth to that. There's also a lot of truth to what Jason was talking about, in that if you don't have a system, Colonel Beau talked about the system. Jason was talking about the parts of that system, a trained non-commissioned officer corps, sergeants, a series of officers at various levels, lieutenants, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, colonels, et cetera, all the way up. Each echelon has its own training, its own experience, and its own time in service, so that they have, lots of opportunities to learn and to experience what it's like, so that they know at progressive levels how to work it. That's why our Army has been so good. The United States Army has been so good in the past, because we have that kind of system. We have people with those kinds of experience and training, professional as well as just experience levels. Ukraine side doesn't have that. And I as someone who has trained armies and certainly have fought in my own, has fought in these large scale armored fights, as well as counterinsurgencies, I can tell you for sure that it is so important, it is crucial and vital to have a chance to win on the battlefield, that you have this kind of force created. But it has to be created in the years before the war. As Doug McGregor has said in some of his books, you get the army that you have prepared for in like the 10 years prior to the war. The idea that you can create one on the fly under fire while you're losing hundreds of thousands of men is just nonsensical. It's a dangerous fantasy that you can do it. And we've seen proof that you can't so far. And almost that alone is going to eliminate the possibility for Ukraine to win, because for all of their initial errors, the Russian side took that advice and it has made some good on it. So there is a new, what they call Northern Army that's apparently formed not far from the Kharkiv area, which according to many intelligence service reports of late, says that the Russians may launch an offensive within weeks, possibly maybe as late as the early June, but maybe even this month. They also have large numbers of forces that they have trained upwards of a year out of contact. So they have done that. So they're now training in unit contract, and they've taken people with experience off the line and they put them in to build these units so that the people who can be trained in a short period of time are matched with people who have the experience at the multiple levels in the echelon is the way that they're fighting. And they have the industrial capacity behind them. Ukraine doesn't have any of those things. So there's really no rational way that Ukraine is even going to hold the line. And there's not even a fantasy path that you can say that they're going to have an offensive, which of course, as we keep saying over and over, should lead to the rational conclusion it's time to seek a negotiated settlement under the best terms available. Those terms won't be a preference. They won't be preferable for Kiev. They won't be nice to them, but they are possible. It's certainly going to require them to give up some territory. But in exchange for doing what makes sense, they maintain control over the bulk of their country. They don't have to lose any more territory. They don't have to lose any more soldiers. They don't have to have any more cities be burned to the ground. All of these things are possible if they seek a negotiated solution, and only more destruction and death awaits Ukraine if they refuse to do what makes sense. That's what we learned today or this week. Next thing, we're going to look on the diplomatic front. We've looked on the battlefields and some potential battlefields of the future, but now we're going to look on the diplomatic front. Of course, there's no better go-to source we have than Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who had a rather interesting take. And in one way, it's kind of surprising because he says, we have a hell of a diplomatic achievement. Now, you don't hear me on this channel or him very often talking about U.S. diplomacy and saying it's achievement, but it does come with an asterisk.
The time when you need to talk to the enemy most is when you're shooting at each other. Of course, you should be talking to them to make sure that doesn't happen, which we don't. But I think it's amazing. We have now no diplomatic dialogue at all with Russia. We have no diplomatic dialogue at all with Iran. We have no diplomatic dialogue to speak of with China. Secretary Blinken went to Beijing for the purpose of having a meeting. The State Department, before he left, said he wasn't going to accomplish anything, and that prediction turned out to be entirely correct. The only thing he did was to push the Chinese closer to the Russians. We have a policy that has succeeded in creating a coalition against us of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Now, that is a hell of a diplomatic achievement. Very hard to pull off. None of them agree about anything except the fact that they're in jeopardy from American attack. Normally, statesmen try to divide enemies rather than unite them. We're doing the opposite.
That's just astounding to me that our diplomacy is so depleted that the only thing that we're accomplishing with both of our operations in the Middle East and our operations on the side of Ukraine against Russia has been to bring our enemies together. So prior to February 2022, you had China, you had Russia, North Korea, and Iran were all kind of stovepipe. They had some interaction with each other, but it was on a very thin level. Russia and China periodically would do joint maneuvers, so they had some relationship. They had some ties militarily, but it was at a distance. They kind of kept each other at arm's length because they've got a lot of historic issues between themselves anyway. And so, they saw common cause to kind of be together, but their differences kind of kept that apart. This war has just shattered all of that. Now then they have a no limits friendship that they have. You have Vladimir Putin is going to be visiting China within a couple of weeks. Later this month, he's going to go down there as well. Lots of reports out about now how China is providing a lot of the electronic components that Russia needs to build its drones and its missile forces. All kinds of other things. China's being very happy to buy Russian oil and gas. They also buy it from Iran. They've now done, you've seen these multiple military maneuvers between China, Iran, and Russia. And of course, Russia has now got direct military assistance from North Korea, direct military assistance in drones and in missiles from Iran. And so they keep getting closer and closer together. And of course, that constrains our actions all across the board. See, there's too little understanding of that. Everybody likes to focus on what's happening on the front line and like we're weakening Russia. That's what we keep hearing over and over. This is weakening Russia. Well, as I've told you, militarily, that was the case earlier in the war. Now it's not. Now Russia's getting stronger and stronger. And already they are now more capable conventionally than they were before February 25th. After all the losses that they've suffered and the probably the thousands of combat vehicles and jets and helicopters that have been knocked down, for all the losses they've had, their gains have been a net plus. And because of their capabilities as a nation, as a military industrial complex, producing the kinds of weapons that are needed in modern warfare, their knowledge of how to defeat American stuff, all these HIMARS, these ATACMS, Abrams tanks, Challenger tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, you name it, the Patriot air defense systems, Iris-T systems from Germany, all of these things now they have knowledge of how to defeat. And they have done that. I don't know if you saw, but on May 1st, there was a big parade in Moscow. They have it every year, May Day, where they had this big, basically a fair of all of these Western equipment that Russia has knocked out. All these things that were supposed to be game changers are sitting in Moscow, and we're being mocked because of it. That's how humiliating it is. That's bad. This, though, at the diplomatic level, is much worse that no one's paying attention to, because we are pushing all of our enemies together and giving them common cause together and reason to work together, and they are. And they're being successful. Now, where this goes once this war is finally brought to a conclusion is unknown, but it's not likely that they're all going to go back to a stovepipe afterwards. They may stay on their own side there. Yeah, Gary's pulling that up there to show you. These are some of our stuff in Moscow. And it's just embarrassing. I saw a video earlier today where there was actually a Western reporter was given access to some of that stuff. I think that one right there is a German tank. Well, okay, that was a Ukrainian with the flag there. But you see that it's like a festive area, and everybody's coming to see and mocking us for what we've put on the battlefield that hasn't changed anything, and their side's winning. And when you see then the diplomatic side, you see that this is all going against our interest, and our leaders who are diplomatic utter incompetence and malpractice. I mean, it's worse than incompetence. They are actually producing the opposite of what the diplomatic corps is supposed to do, which is to keep us safe and to talk to all these other people to try to keep our enemies apart and to try to keep our allies together to make people stronger. The exact opposite of what we're supposed to do is what we have accomplished. It is a shame for our country and something I pray to God gets reversed rather quickly. Last thing we want to talk about today is this pier that you've heard about before. This that President Biden announced at his State of the Union address. In March, I think it was, that we're going to set up this military pier. The U.S. Navy is going to come along with the Army and set this big pier up that's going to move lots of aid and stuff into the Gaza Strip. We've already talked a lot about that over the weeks since that was announced, that, it's ridiculous because all we have to do is just tell Israel to open the gates and they can roll this stuff in there. But for whatever reason, we didn't. So we're still going ahead with it. Well, according to recent reports, it's maybe just a few days now away from being. Gary's showing you some of the construction that's going on there. Now it could come into operation as soon as this weekend. But one other thing we learned this week is that there is a risk to our troops, despite what the president said. Here's an exchange between Representative Gates and Secretary Austin in congressional hearing this week.
This is a very telling moment, Mr. Secretary, because you've said something that's quite possible that could happen, right? Shots from Gaza on our service members, and then the response, our armed service members shooting live fire into Gaza. That is a possible outcome here so that we can become the Port Authority and run this pier. Right?
That's correct. I expect that we will always have the ability to protect ourselves. Don't you think that counts as boots on the ground? President Biden told the country that we weren't going to have boots on the ground in Gaza. And we won't.
Okay, but you guys parse the distinction between, like, when Americans think boots on the ground, they think Americans in harm's way or engaged actively in a conflict. You guys seem to be sort of saying that boots on a pier connected to the ground connected to service members shooting into Gaza doesn't count as boots on the ground?
It does not.
Now, aside from that just being eye roll worthy of absurd, obviously they are in harm's way. So that exchange got some notice. It didn't get a lot. And so I was a little disappointed that people don't seem to be concerned that Americans are going to be in harm's way. And no one knows, because there's lots of people that would have motivation to want to attack the United States. Now, you would think, well, now why would anyone in Hamas want to do that, or in the Gaza Strip? Because they don't want to attack the Americans because they're bringing in food supplies. But there are many people with nefarious interests in the region, and some of them would be only too happy to see the United States be attacked and stop this operation. There are some people that don't want this operation to go in there, because as hard as it is to believe, there are people that actually desire the Palestinian people to starve. So they have some motivation. There's also just some outright evil people that just hate America, and some of these because they believe that the United States has been providing a lot of the military support that Israel is using to kill so many Palestinians, and they don't care about the ramifications. They want to take revenge on the Americans, and they're going to be in a position to do so. Now, Secretary Austin was asked about that since that exchange. He's saying, hey, so what about the possibility of Hamas attacking Americans? Here's what he said.
I think the first question was regarding any credible information that we have that Hamas is going to attack our troops. Of course, I don't discuss intelligence information at the podium, but I don't see any indications currently that there is an active intent to do that. Having said that, Phil, this is a combat zone, and a number of things can happen, a number of things will happen.
And it's so you see, he just hits a caveat there. So basically, he's covered. So if something does happen, he'll say, "Well, I told you it's a combat zone." Why are Americans being put at risk? Listen to me. Listen. Here's what you need to understand: American soldiers will be in harm's way. There is a risk. Whether he claims to have intel or not is irrelevant. We already know there's been mortaring of the pier there. There are many nefarious actors who would love to attack Americans, especially if they're right there in the close. You are putting Americans in harm's way unnecessarily. Let me reiterate this. All President Biden has to do is say, Netanyahu, open up the Eris gates, and instead of making a pier here under hostile fire, we'll go about 5 miles up the road to the Ashdod port that already exists, and we're going to put stuff where it's not in harm's way, and then we're going to roll the trucks up in there nonstop. Or a number of other gates, because there's thousands of trucks that are sitting there that could go in at any time. And none of them would require putting American troops at risk. So I want to know, to the President of the United States, why are you putting American soldiers at risk for something that doesn't even need American soldiers when multiple alternatives exist today that you didn't have to spend $320 million on for the first 90 days? There's no tell. This is something that doesn't have the appearance that it's going to be a short-term thing. And so $320 million is only the opening bid. I assure you this will end up costing a lot more than that. The government is notorious for claiming one thing and then it usually ends up being multiples higher. And I expect that to be the case here. But my primary concern is for those men and women who volunteered to serve our country, to defend us from attack from any other country, are now being basically just put targets. They're being sent somewhere that they're not needed, not for our country, but for somebody else's benefit. And there's lots of fuzzy things on exactly who's actually benefiting from this, but it ain't America. It's not our country, and they are being put at risk, and that bothers me a lot. And if, God forbid, if something does happen to some of those troops, if somebody does lose their lives, I want people to remember this moment. I want people to share this with other people, and I assure you will be sharing it, to say that those lives were lost for nothing. They never needed to be lost. They never needed to be put at risk. And I pray to God that I don't have to show this, because I pray to God no one does get it. It's certainly not a guarantee, and I certainly hope it doesn't. Big time do I hope it doesn't. But the fact that we're putting them at risk, that we have so little concern for the lives of our service members, is really problematic to me. one other thing here we're going to show you today is this Rafah operation. You've been hearing us talk about a lot of that. There's news out today that the Israeli intelligence is saying that Israel apparently has briefed U.S. on a plan, and they're going to move the Gazans ahead of a Rafah operation, as Politico is reporting there. And when you read inside there, it talks about this place they're going to move them to. Gary, if you can throw that other map up, it's going to be on the I guess the southwest corner of the Gaza Strip. You see it circled there in the upper left-hand corner of that map. If you can see it, you may not be able to read the words. It's called the Al-Marawi, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But you see Rafah there in the bottom and center of the screen. It's a large place. It's designed for 250,000 people normally, and there's about 1.4, 1.5 million people there now. It is unclear how they're going to get that many people into this tiny little area in the north. Where will they live? How will they get them out of there? What's the timeline? We don't have any of those answers right now. But that's what's being briefed right now. So apparently this operation is going to come in soon. You see the IDF has actually used some of the time that they've had to get a lot of the, you may remember when they withdrew from a lot of the southern part of like Khan Yunis. A lot of that was to get ready for the Rafah operation. They needed to reset, refit, to do some maintenance on their vehicles. But now it looks like they're getting ready to go in again. And of course, many in the United States, in the West, and definitely in the region have raised alarm bells for Israel moving into this area, because they don't see so far a credible plan to actually protect the population. And here just yet again, and this has happened so many times for these people since October of last year, where they keep having to move from one place to another. I mean, they're literally nomads in their own land. And now they're going to be going into a place where there's almost no infrastructure. That area around the beach that I just showed you on the map, there's hardly any infrastructure there at all. I don't know where these people are going to live, where they're going to, just simple things like go to the bathroom. I mean, where do that many people just had to take care of those kinds of things? And that's a huge issue. And of course, as I told you earlier this week, also, there's a lot of warning from the United Nations and some of these other groups. And USAID, I'll point out, it's not just the UN, is saying that the entire population of Gaza, all 2.1 million, however many are still alive, are already at significant risk of famine. They all need external support. There is no internal capacity to feed themselves. Every bit of it comes from the outside. So something's going to go on for a lot longer. So their misery is going to continue to get worse. And if the Israeli forces go in Rafah and they're not careful enough, the casualties could just go through the roof. At the same time, lots of starvation deaths start happening if that food aid doesn't get in there. This can go so bad. And you just need to understand that we are definitely not through the worst of this. Much worse is yet to come. And the last couple of things I want to give you is some recent intel out that I actually saw just earlier today. So this is very fresh stuff. The first one is that the Russians have unveiled a new weapon. It's called the TOS flamethrower. This particular version is called the Dragon, and it's a thermobaric basically rocket system. And the TOS flamethrower is just, you may have heard this say, it's just a name. It's not literally throwing flame like you may have seen in World War II. It's a thermobaric bomb, which basically means the warhead goes over a place. The warhead itself comes apart, and it puts this like gassy kind of explosive into the air. Then it ignites it with a second charge, and there's this overpressure, which just causes this enormous explosion that's much more destructive than a standard high explosive warhead, like from an artillery shell or something like that. It is absolutely devastating. The scenes you see on the screen here is what it looks on the ground. This used to be a forest. And these TOS flamethrower systems, along with some of the big FAB heavy bombs that we've shown you before, this is what it looks like on the ground. And now then, this version here is reported to be 3 times stronger than the flamethrower system that was used to make those images that you see on there. So the situation for Ukraine just keeps going from bad to worse. And one last piece of information here also, you may not have seen this. This is breaking news in Berlin. There was a fire at the Iris-T system where they manufactured the interceptor missiles for one of the successful systems that has been helping the Ukraine side. They haven't had enough of them, but the Iris-T has been pretty effective at shooting down Russian missiles. And now then where they make the interceptor missiles, which Ukraine is in desperate need of course, has this mysterious fire. No one can say if it just happened to happen, if it was sabotage. It's unknown, but it's going to be a big, big problem because that's one of the primary plants where the Iris-T missiles are made. And if that thing is out of sequence, then Ukraine could be in real trouble in going forward here. Every way you want to look, folks, Ukraine is in real trouble. I've said it many times. We talked about it earlier in this episode. Every aspect on the ground that you want to see, all the actual facts, the reality says that we should try to seek a negotiated settlement for Ukraine. And look, all these people who were these cheerleaders about wanting to give more weapons and everything to Israel, to Ukraine, are oblivious to the carnage that is happening and the damage that they are enabling to be done to the very people they claim to be waving flags for. Because by giving this money and giving this moral support, all we do is give them false hope that with enough time, maybe later they can get more stuff and then reverse all the stuff. Even though they failed utterly last year, maybe next year it will be different, but it won't be different. There's no rational path to say that. There's no logic that would be behind it when you see the continuing disparity in the growth of the balance of power, the imbalance of power on Russia's side and on the Ukraine side. Everything screams it's only going to get worse. And more people are going to die. A lot of the people you're waving those flags for are not going to be here tomorrow. Others won't be here a week or a month from now, 6 months from now, if the war continues on that far. But the end is already written. Any rational observation without emotion would see that. And if we actually care about the Ukrainian people, it's time for us to stop waving silly flags that are getting more of them killed and start doing the adult business of real diplomacy and taking the hard choices of this is what reality is and this is what is achievable and this is fiction and fantasy, and stop making policy based on fantasy. It's getting people killed. We're doing the same thing in the Middle East. We're making decisions that are not, Israel is not going to win this war, folks. I don't care what happens in Rafah. The thought that they're going to get the final 4 battalions, which Netanyahu and all of his people keep saying over and over, that's not going to end the war. That's not going to end the threat to Israel. Israel has created so much more animosity toward them than existed prior to the start of this war. I can't even measure it. I can't even quantify it. It's off the charts. All the things that existed that caused Hamas to take this heinous action on October 7th is going to be 10 times greater than it was before after this Rafah operation is so-called finished. And of course, I think the chances are high that once Israel does finish with Rafah, that they're then going to turn and go into Lebanon. I can't imagine that they're going to just say, all right, we call the war over because we finished in Rafah and now then we're done, and leave Hezbollah right where it's at, because they, you may know that they have these barrages going back and forth every day here. And so I can't imagine that Israel's going to say we're going to stop the war while that risk still goes on, because they have somewhere around 100,000 plus Israeli citizens who have been ordered evacuated from a band of area in the northern part of Israel because of the risk of Hezbollah, because of these rocket and other exchanges of fire that happens on almost a daily basis. Israel's going to want to do that too. They won't succeed there either. All they're going to do is get more people killed, and it won't solve the problem. The instability that is at the core of all of this will continue on. Netanyahu said he is absolutely adamantly opposed to a two-state solution. He said he will not have it, quote, rammed down our throat by anyone. And of course, by anyone means the United States, which we still have the fiction that is there's still going to be a two-state solution. Until all this gets fixed, there will be no peace for Israel. The people of Israel who have been so much behind all these operations, the American people who have been waving their Israeli flags and saying they support all this stuff, are just setting the stage for more instability and more violence indefinitely for the very people of Israel that claim to want to help. That is the truth, folks. I'm giving you the real intel here. We're not sugarcoating anything. That's the case right now. Ambassador Freeman correctly called out the just near incapacity of our diplomatic corps and the people at the top here. We have got to get something changed. And right now, the best thing that we can do, the only power that we have right now, is the power of ideas and the spreading of the word. And the social media and channels like this give us at least a chance to have a voice. Share this with everyone you know. Send this to everyone. You hear me say it before, please do this. Like and subscribe, because that helps the YouTube algorithm spread the channel further and more people can get to see it. But we need to spread this out on Twitter, on Instagram, whatever, Telegram, whatever you have. Share these things with your friends and loved ones, with your lawmakers, with other influencers. Tag them on this stuff. Let's get the word out there, folks. It's time for some hard truth here. It's time to do some hard choices that aren't what we want to do, but are necessary to save the lives of the people we claim to support. It's time to do that. And I hope you'll join me in doing that. We thank you so much for joining us. We're going to keep doing this every week, giving you an update on intel, things that you learned during the week in case you're not able to watch all the episodes. And we always have new stuff on Friday like we did here today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.